WABC.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's incredible, but one whole year, as a matter of fact, over a year, has gone. A year and a month has gone since I looked up on the podium there and saw the 107th mayor of the city of New York taking the oath, his inauguration as mayor. And what an incredible year that has been. I'm sure that even then, Rudolph Giuliani didn't know what a tumultuous year it would be. But, Mr. Mayor, I welcome you to our studio. It's been a long time since we've had the opportunity to interview you, to talk to you. And I would say that now that a lot of people have checked in with their opinions of your leadership of the city, your first year in office has been a success. You have attempted to carry out the promises that you had made during the campaign. And as you sit here and look back on these past 13 months, what do you think?
I'm satisfied with it. I think we have accomplished most of the things that we wanted to accomplish in the first year. I'm an impatient person, so I probably would like to have accomplished even more. But I'm very satisfied with the fact that we moved the city in the right direction. And when I look back on it, I also think that it was very fortunate that we did. Otherwise, the city would have, great difficulties understanding the changes that are taking place now in Washington and Albany. But instead, we're kind of ahead of those changes. We started workfare a month or two ago. We downsized New York City government by 15,000 workers. We reduced the budget by over $2 billion, and now have the approval of the city council for what we did because we were able to work it out with them. So a lot of the things that are happening at the state level, national level, New York City, for once, is kind of ahead of the game and ready for the changes that are going to take place.
Recently, you scored a victory in seeing the merger of the transit police and the city police. Unfortunately, weren't able to get the housing police in. But I had heard people say, that's where Rudy's hard-headedness paid off. Did you hear remarks like that?
Yeah. I think one of the newspapers said that in the editorial, too. This is something that Mayor Koch wanted to achieve, came very close to doing it. Mayor Dinkins did. It makes sense. We have 3 different police departments in New York City. The NYPD, which is the largest, 31,000. The housing police, which is about 2,500, 3,000, that vicinity. And then the transit police, which are about 4,500. So we want to put them together into one police department, under one police commissioner, 2 separate bureaus, one for transit, one for housing. And this has been the cause of a tremendous amount of fighting. Well, we finally were able to achieve it with the transit police. And I think we're going to be able to achieve it with the housing police. There's one judge who is holding it up in court. Paul Crotty, the Corporation Counsel, has appealed her decision. And we're very hopeful that the appellate division will rule in our favor so that we can go ahead with the housing police. That would mean that Commissioner Bratton could deploy the police officers a lot more effectively. We would be able to do away with, we have things like 3 separate payroll offices, 3 separate public relations offices, 3 separate administrative offices, 3 separate detective divisions, 3 separate emergency services. We have 3 separate everything. When in fact, all we need is one. And we can save a lot of police officers that way and get them assigned to enforcement, which is what they should be doing.
A lot of people will lose their fiefdoms, though.
Some people will lose what are commonly called cushy jobs,
yeah.
But, the city has to go through that. And that isn't just true of the police. It's true in all areas of the city. It's probably less true of the police than it is in many other areas of the city, in which the city was spending a lot more money than it had. The city had a lot more workers than it needed. We've removed, believe it or not, since the year that I've been in office, 16,000 just about workers from New York City. And I really don't think things have changed all that much, which means that a lot of those workers weren't necessary in the first place because the city was inefficient. And it continues to be inefficient, which is why we can do more.
Have you found that the bureaucracy that you inherited is something that is even more gargantuan than you had thought? Is it really possible? I've read editorials from time to time that it's impossible to really tame the bureaucracy. What do you say?
Yes and no. I've been very, very pleasantly surprised and very unpleasantly surprised. Let me give you an example. The sanitation department. When I started, there was lots of concerns about the sanitation department, about their not working 8 hours a day, about their contract being out of line with the contract of the police and the firefighters, about a lack of productivity, some of the agreements the prior administration had reached with them. We found that by challenging them, working with them, through the good work of Randy Levine, the labor commissioner, and John Doherty, the sanitation commissioner, the sanitation department agreed to a different contract, allowed us to consider privatization, which had been not allowed in the contract under the Dinkins administration. And now we find that the sanitation department, that the workers in the sanitation department, in many, many situations are exceeding our expectations and doing a really very good job. I think people were very, very pleasantly surprised with the way the snow was picked up this weekend. I think they were very pleasantly surprised, even though it happened 17 times last year. So I think there you've got a group of people that are responding by having been challenged to work a little harder, do a better job. On the other hand, if you look at the Board of Education, we've got a bureaucracy that is immovable. And unfortunately, a board, and to some extent the chancellor, that isn't being strong enough in trying to challenge what's going on there. The most recent revelations being the ones that Marcia Kramer did on Channel 2 the other night, I guess it was last night, in which we find that there are people working at the Board of Education that are selling school property, stealing it and selling it, and getting kickbacks. And so, and that's a small example of why the $8 billion that's going into education, which is what the city hands over to the chancellor, $8 billion, a lot of it doesn't get down to the classroom and the schoolroom. A lot of that $8 billion moves off in directions of administrators, supervisors, and as we see here, unfortunately, in some cases, corruption. That's something that we have not had enough progress in. But here, the governor and I both support giving the mayors of all the big cities control of the budget of the Board of Education. I don't have control right now, believe it or not. If I had control, I can assure you the $8 billion would go to the classrooms and the schoolrooms and not to the supervisors, the administrators, the panels of supervisors and administrators, the consultants, and some of the situations like the one that was on Channel 2 the other night.
To put it bluntly, which is certainly nothing unusual for me, you wanted to get rid of Ramon Cortinas, right?
Well, I mean, to put it bluntly, I had thought that he was not making the kind of progress that he should be making in the areas that I'm just talking about. His views of education, his views of curriculum, even some of the things that he's been able to do in stabilizing the system from the point of view of the debates that used to be going on 2 years ago and 3 years ago, all of that's to his credit. And on those areas, I'm satisfied or even more than satisfied. But in one critical area, he has not been able to do the job, and that is getting control of this bureaucracy and running it rather than letting it run him. That's a critical thing that has to be done if you're going to be an effective administrator and leader in New York City. And what he accomplished here is the $8 billion has to go to the classrooms and the schoolrooms and not to that big giant establishment that has been sucking up so much of it. And it doesn't go to the classrooms and the schoolrooms. The children aren't being served. And unfortunately, a lot of the parents don't get that message. They're confused by a lot of the rhetoric in the system.
Were you surprised at the number of allies or supporters that Ramon Cortinas had?
No. But I actually thought that it was an excellent example of what's wrong here. This is a system that should change. It's a system that has been going in the wrong direction for 20, 25 years. The fact that all the people who put the system together supported him has to tell you that he isn't making the changes that have to be made. And I'm hopeful that now that he's sitting there and this has all worked itself out, that we can get him to be a lot more aggressive in these areas. I'm hopeful, for example, that he would support the bill that'll be introduced in Albany with the support of just about every mayor in the state and Governor Pataki. I'm hopeful that he'll support the bill that will give the mayor and the city council control of the budget of the Board of Education. This budget is a gigantic part of the overall budget of the city. It's 26% of the budget of New York City goes to education. That's $8 billion. I have nothing to say about what happens to it other than to turn the money over to him. And that just isn't fair. It isn't fair to the taxpayers because I'm the one that in 2.5 years, if they don't like what I'm doing with that money, they can throw me out of office. If they do like what I'm doing with that money, they can keep me there. And I think I've demonstrated in a year and a half, that I can be accountable about the handling of money for the city. We've done it in all the other areas. We could do a far better job for education, and the kids would be the ones that would benefit because the money would go to the classrooms and the schoolrooms, and I would relentlessly remove all of the administration, all of the supervisors. All we need is a very small administration for the system. Most of the money should go to classrooms and schoolrooms.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've just tuned in and you say, my, that voice sounds familiar, it should be. It is the mayor of the city of New York, Rudolph Giuliani. In a little while, we'll be taking some telephone calls. I have more questions for His Honor. Mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani. You're looking back on your first year. What do you feel was your best moment or your best moments? What?
I think the way we handled the crises that occurred in the city, and particularly at the very beginning, helped to assure people that we could provide leadership, that it would be balanced, that it would be sensible, that it would be stable. I'm thinking back to the mosque incident, in which we didn't cave in to what was politically correct, did the right thing, treated everyone the same way. And I'm thinking back to the incident on the Brooklyn Bridge, in which the Hasidic students were shot by a gunman, and it was right at the time in which there were a lot of tensions between Israel and the Arab neighbors, and it could have really become a very terrible situation in the city. Police department responded immediately, caught the person who did it within 24 hours. We were able to actually create some relationships that didn't exist before between the Arab community and the Jewish community in Crown Heights and other parts of the city. We sort of turned a situation that could have been a destabilizing situation into a much better one. In Crown Heights last year, Rosh Hashanah fell on the same day as the Caribbean Parade. For 7 or 8 months, there was a fear that how would I handle it? How would my administration? Wouldn't we make it worse? This was going to lead to terrible problems? Remember the riots of a few years ago? I think what we demonstrated is that by working with people, by being fair with people, by having one standard for everyone, both the Caribbean community, the Hasidic community there, were able to work together. The parade took place, the celebration of Rosh Hashanah took place, and it was a harmonious occasion, not one that led to lots of rancor. So I think that ultimately, the point that I made when I was running, that you really should have one standard for everyone in the city. You should put aside race, religion, ethnic background as almost the sole way in which people were being looked at, and treat everyone the same way. And after a year and a half, they would see that you would be fair with everyone. I think a lot of that got through, and I think people feel that now. I think a lot of people feel it, maybe not everyone. So I think it's a much more stable city than maybe it was a year and a half ago. And then the crime rates going down as much as they did. Murder was down 18.5% last year, the biggest decline ever in the history of the city. Robbery was down by almost the same number. Crime was down all over. One of the things that many of my critics would not accept at the beginning. Remember when we started our campaign against squeegee operators, to try to get them off the street, to try to get the aggressive panhandlers off the street, to try to do something about graffiti, the quality of life things. Here what the response to that was a year ago. You can't do that, because if you do that, you're not going to be able to use the police for murder, you're not going to be able to use them for robbery, you won't be able to use them for drugs, you'll be wasting resources on these small things. It was my view and Commissioner Bratton's view that the small things are important. That when you let those things get out of control, it starts to lead to more murder, more disorganization, more serious crimes, and then you have to do both. You have to have an appropriate emphasis on both. Well, we have done a lot about quality of life. These people were criticizing us for it, and now what they have to deal with is it also happens to be that we got the biggest decline in murder ever in the history of the city, the biggest decline in robbery, and in many categories, the biggest declines in major crime, which I think gives confidence to people that the general approach that I have and Commissioner Bratton has for the police department is one that works. Plus, I think you see that the police department is a department of much higher morale today than it was a year and a half ago, which means they just do their job better.
I know a lot of people on the job. They tell me just what you've indicated. Regrets. What regrets, if any?
I think that two, really. I would like to have done more about education, what we were talking about before. I really would like us to see the same kind of reforms in the Board of Education that we've been able to bring about in the police department, that we've been able to bring about in the sanitation department, that we've been able to do because we took it away from the Board of Education with the custodians. We've made a lot of changes in city government. We've got it operating more effectively. We were able to save a lot of money and at the same time, in some cases, really even improve the service. Some of that is happening in the Board of Education. We've been able to take out administrators for the first time, about 2,500. But that was a 6-month battle with the chancellor and the board in order to get that done. The reason it's so important, it's not just about balancing the budget here. That's the only way to get the money for the classrooms and the schoolrooms. You've got to take it out of the $8 billion we're presently spending, get it to the classrooms and the schoolrooms, because there isn't any more money to spend. Albany's not going to give us any more money. It doesn't have it. They've got a $5 billion deficit. Washington isn't going to give us any more money. They've got their own budget balancing problems. So if you're going to find the money to educate youngsters better, you're going to have to find it out of the first $8 billion that we have, which, after all, is not such an unreasonable thing to ask us to do, to spend that much more intelligently. I'd like to have made more progress there. And I guess in looking back on the budget, we did it really in 2 stages. We first reduced it by about $100 million. Then we had to reduce it again later in the year. Looking back, I think I would have preferred to have done it all at once. And to the extent that my advice is worth anything to the governor, it's one of the things that I said to him he should really look at when he put together his first budget. Be aggressive at the very beginning. What happened was we were as aggressive as we thought we could be. We reduced it by 100,000. Then we had to go back for another budget modification. That got into a big battle with the city council, which took a while to resolve, but last week we were able to resolve it, and then we reduced another $1.7 billion. Probably would have been better to do that all at once. Might have had a longer political battle at the beginning, but we would have gotten it over with quicker. So now that we're putting our budget together for this time, we're trying to be, maybe put a little more of it up front.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a brief time out so we can catch up on the traffic and a few other pieces of business. When we return with Mayor Giuliani, I will ask the big question.
Sure. I would have. The facts that I had at the time, I would have made the same decision. Made the same decision again that I made then. I felt that Mario would have been better for the city than George Pataki, and that's why I made the decision, even though it's hard for people to understand it. It's now a number of months later. I don't look back, I look forward. And the fact is that George Pataki and I have worked, I think, well together to try to deal with the problems of the city. I think he has been very understanding of the difficulties of the city. And I think mutually, I've been understanding of the problems of the state, and not put him in a position where we're asking him to do unrealistic things. I know he has to cut $5 billion. I've had to cut $2.5 to $3 billion from the city budget, so I can empathize with him. I understand the difficulties of that. So the way in which we've worked with him is to look for ways in which the things we're asking for are things that will help him achieve his objective and also help the city achieve the same objective. So we've developed a good working relationship. That's in the past. I don't look back, but I look forward.
So the bottom line for the citizen of New York City and New York State, which is really what counts, is that you can say that you and the new governor have worked well together thus far, and that your relationship is off to a good start.
Absolutely. After a very rocky start,
yeah,
right? Particularly given some of the personal feelings that it all engendered, I would say that we've worked remarkably well together. And there's a reason for that, and that is to not completely, not maybe in certain areas, but generally we share very much the same philosophy. His budget of a week ago in categories is almost exactly the same as my budget of a year ago. He had to reduce the size of state government. I reduced the size of city government. He's had to deal with entitlement programs. That's precisely what we're trying to do, to reduce them. He has to make the city, he has to make the state, as I had to make the city, fiscally responsible. We share those objectives. Also, as the mayor of the city of New York, unlike some of the politicians in the city, I see the value to the city of the state being fiscally responsible. That's going to mean more jobs for us. When I have to go to a business, this morning, my deputy mayor for economic development and I met with a very representatives of a very large business that are considering leaving the city or possibly staying in the city and expanding. We're talking now about the difference between 4,000 and 5,000 jobs and the possibility of growth well beyond that. It has been very, very helpful for me in retaining businesses to have the kind of budget plan that I have. It was very helpful for me today to put on the table not only my budget plan for the city, to show businesses that we're pro-business, that we want to keep them, that we want to work with them. It's very helpful to also lay on the table George Pataki's budget plan, which says to businesses, we're not going to get killed by the city, and now it looks like we're not going to get killed by the state. There's an understanding that a balanced economy, meaning a reduced government, more growth in the private sector, will produce more jobs for us. So because I guess we share that outlook, it's easier for us to work together. We share a very similar outlook on crime, in which we've got to toughen up the laws of the state to deal with the problem of crime. So there are lots of areas in which we can work together. There probably will be areas on which we disagree, and maybe even strongly disagree, but so far, that hasn't happened.
It's very difficult to know what the right thing is at times. You had promised to get rid of the 18% hotel tax, and it's one of the promises that you kept. Rudy Giuliani is a new type of politician. He's trying to keep the promises that he made. And yet, I see that the hotels said, hey, look, we got rid of the 18% tax.
So let's
jack up the prices.
Okay, now, but that isn't such a bad solution. I would have preferred if they kept the prices the same, but just think of what that accomplishes. That moves more money to the private sector. The difference becomes, instead of the government glomming it, the business makes more of a profit. The business hires more people in the hotel. The business hires more people in the restaurants. The businesses hire more people to work for them. So that money is put back into the private economy, and we have more jobs in the hotel industry. So there's something else going on with hotels. Hotels for the last 6 months of last year into this year, and I'll project it for the rest of this year, are dealing with occupancy rates that are almost record levels now.
Yeah.
We're talking about fully occupied hotels in New York City for 6-7 months in a row, and I think it's going to remain that way. The reduction of the hotel occupancy tax has helped to sustain that, and I think make it even stronger. Now, what does that mean? That means not only are there more people working, not only are they returning more people, more dollars into the economy, people spending more money in the city, it means that it might start occurring to people, let's start building a few more hotels. If all our hotels are occupied and you can't get a room in New York, and that remains for a period of time, then somebody's going to come along and say, let's build another hotel or 2 or 3, and that's how you revive an economy. And that's all just out of the reduction of the hotel occupancy tax.
Well, I hope. Look, I believe in. I don't think there's anybody who believes more in free enterprise than I do, but I hope the hotels don't abuse the demand and jack up the prices and be guilty of gouging. What if they? What if they should do that?
I hope they don't, but the market will correct for that.
Okay.
And the fact is, if we can have 100% occupancy or 90% occupancy, you really stretch it, and there isn't hotel space in this city. That is exactly what's going to create the momentum toward putting more money back into construction and start building more hotels. So, I mean, we have a private economy. We have to regulate it at times, but I'm definitely against over-regulating.
All right, let's take some telephone calls. I promised we'd go public with the mayor. He's here for only about 17 more minutes. So let's try Frank from Whitestone. Yes, Frank.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor.
Hi, Frank. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine, sir. Have you been watching Channel 31 WNYC lately?
No, I haven't been watching it lately.
Well, I've got 2 flashes for you.
What?
Number 1.
They doing political agenda stuff?
Well, it's very subtle, but you know what I'm talking about. Let me get to point number 1.
Right.
This Wednesday morning at 1:30, they are commemorating a festival, a jubilee, for the late Miles Davis. This is one man that should be put down and that should be aired, and I'll explain to you why.
Very quickly, please.
I had seen Mr. Davis on another show on television, and he was being interviewed by this interviewer. And he said to him, he asked him, Miles, what would be the last thing on this earth if you had a minute to live? What would you do? And you know what his reply was? To choke a white man, which I think is it's a terrible thing to say. Point number 2. Last Sunday, not yesterday, but Sunday ago yesterday, there was a show called TV Families. This is going to blow your mind, Mr. Mayor. It was an agenda against an Asian family. And they showed, and I saw the show, they showed a teenage daughter performing filet show, but it was blocked out with those little glittering squares.
I'm glad you called, Frank.
And then they showed their son masturbating, gloating over.
Wait a minute, what is this, Channel 31? You're telling us that was on Channel?
Yes, sir. Huh? They showed the son, this was obscured, But you know what he was doing? He was masturbating, reading a male homosexual book. Then they showed the mother.
We get the idea. Now, what is your point, Frank?
My point is, let's get rid of Channel 31 and privatize it, and let's sell it immediately.
But, you know, look, I'm all in favor of privatization. And this is probably as good an example of it as any. I don't know if what he's saying is true. The government should not be in the business of having radio stations and television stations and be involved in programming. And otherwise you have alleged problems like this one. People are offended by taste, they're offended by political message. So what we're trying to do with WNYC is to see if we can come up with a solution so we move it out to the private sector. And then, you know, it's very likely that somebody's not going to like the programming even when it's owned by the private sector.
You think there's
then it's not a government problem.
Is this doable? Do you think you could,
yes, it's doable.
Get this done?
Everything is doable.
But it seems every time I pick up a paper, anytime I read an editorial, they're blasting you for wanting to sell these.
I really don't quite understand why people have such great difficulty with the basic fundamental notion that in America, with the First Amendment and everything else that we treasure so much, governments should not be owning radio stations, television stations, and newspapers. Remember the kinds of governments that used to own radio stations, television stations, and newspapers. They were behind the Iron Curtain. They all owned radio stations and television stations, and government shouldn't be in that business. That's for private enterprise. And then you're going to still have all these same problems. There are going to be people who have left-wing messages, right-wing messages, messages that are tasteless, but it's not a problem then of government. And hopefully we will be able to eventually get there as we look at the different solutions to this.
Yes, Mayor, a few moments ago you were asked about the hotel tax,
right?
Something which received a lot of publicity in the press. But there's another tax which I believe you ran on reducing or eliminating, which was the unincorporated business tax.
Right.
And, you know, don't expect the press to ask you about it because they don't pay it and they don't know it exists.
Yeah, I know it exists. It's in our financial plan to reduce next year and the year after.
Okay.
And we also reduced our financial plan called for the following. To reduce the hotel occupancy tax immediately from 21.25% to 15.25%, which we've done. To reduce the commercial rent tax and to start with the smallest businesses first. And we're reducing it and eliminating it over a 4-year period, phasing it in. To reduce the unincorporated business tax in year 2 and 3 of the plan. And then to do away with the income tax surcharge and to reduce some other taxes, including property taxes. And so far, we've been able to deliver on that, and we've been able to do it on schedule. I'd like to do more, but I also face a $2.5 to $3 billion budget deficit, or gap, so I also have to be looking at reducing that at the same time. The faster we can reduce that, eliminate expenses in government, the more aggressive we can be about tax reduction, which I'd like to do.
Thank you very much, Connell. You're on WABC with Mayor Giuliani. Go ahead.
Good evening, Mayor Giuliani.
Hi, Connell. How are you?
Yeah, let me congratulate you on the superb job you're doing as mayor of New York City.
Thank you.
I work in a New York City public school, and evidently the curriculum calls for a certain amount of AIDS education during the course of the year. The school invited a panel from the Department of Health to lecture the kids for about an hour or so on AIDS, and I popped in on this lecture. Prior to the lecture, they handed out a handout, a one-page handout. Both sides were typed on. The first one gave a series of behaviors and whether it was a risk or not a risk.
How old were the youngsters?
This was first they did the seniors and then they did the rest of it.
High school seniors?
High school seniors,
okay.
And then they did the rest. The first part, they discussed abstinence for about 2 minutes and then went on about using a condom for about 40 minutes. But that's not the problem I have with it. The second part of the discussion, they gave a series of 10 questions, which seemed to me had a lot more to do with indoctrinating them into a politically correct way of thinking than teaching them about AIDS. And I'll just read you a couple. And there's one in particular I have to that really infuriated me that I'd like to touch with you. Blacks and Hispanics have higher rates of HIV infection because they don't change their lifestyle. Women with HIV...
Because I didn't get that one.
Okay,
Blacks and Hispanics have higher...
rates of HIV infection because they don't change their lifestyle. This is the one that infuriated me, and I'll just... Their answer, and there was the students were to put whether they disagreed or agreed with this statement. And the answer from the panel was, well, the first part of this statement is true. Statistically, blacks and Hispanics have higher rates of HIV infection. But the second part is not true because the determining factors for HIV infection, for them getting the AIDS virus, is the culture and religion, is what
Do you have a question out of all of
yeah,
this?
the question is this. They went on to say that, for instance, the Catholic religion doesn't...
Do you have a question out of all of this,
Yes,
sir?
it's based on this next part. The woman in the panel said, for instance, the Catholic religion does not allow the use of condoms, and therefore blacks and Hispanics tend to have a higher rates because they don't use the condom.
Well, is there...
Well,
That was being taught in the school.
that was...
That's the point. The point is that someone teaching the AIDS education program made that statement that, in essence, part of the reason why blacks or Hispanics would have higher percentages of AIDS infection comes from the fact that some of them are Catholics?
That was said by a Department of Health panel, a person on the Department of Health panel that was called into the school to tell this to the kids. Now, that, to me, that borders on anti-Catholic bigotry, because...
All right, okay.
Well, I mean...
Okay, we get the point.
I can't address myself to the whole thing. I wasn't there. I don't know exactly what was said. This is a very, very sensitive area for education. It has to be done by very sensible people. If somebody made a statement like that, it was obviously a very ignorant statement and a very insensitive statement.